Here's what nobody tells you about infantry loadouts. The best weapon on the battlefield didn't win the war. The best system did. February 1945, Iwo Jima. Marine Corporal Tony Stein is moving through volcanic rock and concentrated fire, carrying a weapon that has no business being in an infantryman's hands. A .30 caliber aircraft strafing gun he personally converted into a portable LMG, cycling at 1,200 rounds per minute. The Japanese troops trying to stop him are armed with Arisaka rifles featuring chrome-lined bores so metallurgically advanced that the United States wouldn't standardize that same technology in their own weapons until the 1960s. Two of the finest examples of infantry engineering on the same battlefield. One side lost. That's the question this ranking demands we answer honestly. We're evaluating 8 nations on 4 criteria only: production volume, logistical coherence, doctrinal fit, and battlefield adaptability. To understand why the US sits at the top, you first have to understand why China sits at the bottom, and why that story is far more complicated than you think. If that's the kind of military history that cuts through the mythology, subscribe, because that's all we do here. Before we rank a single loadout, we need to establish something that most of these videos completely ignore. None of these weapons were designed in a vacuum. Every one of them was shaped by industrial reality, strategic pressure, and military doctrine. And understanding that context is what separates a genuine analysis from a simple popularity contest. Consider what China was working with. In 1938, the Hanyang arsenal, one of the nation's primary small arms manufacturers, was physically evacuated under Japanese aerial bombardment, relocated piece by piece to Chongqing as the 21st Arsenal. These men were manufacturing rifles while fleeing for their lives. That is not a metaphor for adversity. That is the literal industrial condition under which the National Revolutionary Army was expected to fight a modern war. Italy's situation was different, but equally revealing. The Breda 30's notorious oil pump, the feature that made every serious student of the war wince, was not an engineering oversight. It was a calculated patch for a violent blowback extraction cycle that lacked the primary leverage to pull hot, expanded casings cleanly. The solution was sound. The problem was that it produced a weapon demanding obsessive maintenance in a military that couldn't guarantee obsessive conditions. France offers perhaps the most misunderstood design choice of the entire war. The MAS-36 had no manual safety, not because of cost cutting, but because French military doctrine explicitly prohibited them. Command theory held that safeties failed in mud, and that fire discipline was an officer's responsibility, not a mechanical one. That doctrine made sense on paper. It collapsed the moment the Wehrmacht's tempo made coordinated officer commands impossible. At the opposite poles of the doctrinal spectrum sat Germany and the United States. German infantry were functionally redesignated as ammunition carriers. Their primary combat role was keeping the MG-42 fed. American doctrine inverted that logic entirely, distributing lethality across every rifleman in the squad. The doctrine explains the design explains the performance. So let's go country by country, starting with the hardest story to tell. Let's run the numbers. Country by country, worst to best. China. The National Revolutionary Army's primary rifle wasn't the modern Chiang Kai-shek Type 24. It was the Hanyang 88, a design rooted in the 1880s. Over 1.1 million Hanyangs were produced, versus only 360,000 to 600,000 Type 24s. Elite NRA divisions carried roughly 1/3 the LMG allocation of their Japanese opponents. The Type Han wasn't a choice. It was a ceiling. Italy. The Breda 30 achieved a practical rate of fire of 150 rounds per minute when the mandatory oil pump was functioning. The Carcano M1891 bolt rifle, however, deserves a closer look. Its internal magazine held 6 rounds, one more than German, Japanese, or Soviet equivalents. A genuine technical edge, rendered irrelevant by the system around it. France. By May 1940, France had produced exactly 250,000 MAS-36 rifles for an army that needed multiples of that figure. The emergency R-35 program began cutting down obsolete LeBel rifles into carbines just to cover the gap. That single production statistic tells you everything about French industrial readiness for a modern land war. Japan. In 1945, Major General Julian Hatcher's team at Aberdeen Proving Ground subjected the Arisaka Type 99 to pressure testing. The receiver held 120,000 pounds per square inch without failure. American M1903s and German Mausers failed between 70,000 and 90,000 pounds per square inch. The Arisaka also carried the first chrome-lined bore of any mass-produced infantry rifle in history, a corrosion solution the U.S. Army wouldn't adopt as standard for another 2 decades. Soviet Union. The PPS-43 submachine gun required 2.7 hours of machining time and 50% less raw steel than its predecessor, the PPS-H-41, which demanded 7.3 hours. Meanwhile, the squad's DP-27 light machine gun carried a critical flaw. Its recoil spring sat beneath the barrel, directly in the heat path. Sustained fire warped it. That defect wasn't corrected until the 1943 DPM variant. United Kingdom. The Bren gun and the Lee-Enfield rifle shared an identical .303 cartridge, a logistical coherence the Germans never achieved between their squad weapons. The Sten submachine gun cost $10 to manufacture. The Thompson cost $200. Germany. The MG42 cycled at 1,200 rounds per minute, a rate so high that individual shots were acoustically indistinguishable. Its barrel reached critical heat after just 250 rounds, approximately 12.5 seconds of sustained fire. Trained crews swapped barrels in under 10 seconds. At 2,000 meters, its beaten zone, the lethal dispersion pattern, covered an area roughly the size of a 2-car garage. United States. A standard American rifle squad of 8 to 12 men, each carrying a semi-automatic M1 Garand, could sustain a volume of fire that had no single point of failure. Remove the BAR, and the squad still fights. That architecture was the foundation of everything. Numbers on paper are one thing. What happened when these weapons met the actual conditions of war is something else entirely. The specifications told you what these weapons were designed to do. The battlefield told you what they actually did. China. The NRA's LMG shortage wasn't a statistic. It was a death sentence at the squad level. Chinese frontline units routinely entered engagements against Japanese squads carrying 3 times their automatic fire allocation. The Hanyang 88 continued outproducing the modern Type 24 rifle until 1944, not because anyone preferred it, but because a factory evacuating under aerial bombardment produces what it can, not what it wants. Volume over quality, under fire, with no alternative. Italy. In 1941, a U.S. military intelligence assessment evaluated the Breda 30 against the British Bren under extreme dust conditions and reached a conclusion that still surprises people. The Breda was judged mechanically superior. The explanation is darkly ironic. Italian soldiers maintained their weapons with near neurotic obsession, precisely because they understood the cost of neglect. A weapon that demanded perfection performed perfectly in the hands of men who had no margin for error. The problem was that a military at war cannot institutionalize perfection. The moment maintenance discipline broke down under combat conditions, the Breda's engineering vulnerabilities became catastrophic liabilities. France. The MAS-36 was a genuinely sound rifle. What failed wasn't the weapon, it was the doctrine built around it. Carrying empty chambers, loading only on an officer's command, relying on coordinated group fire. That system required time, communication, and command continuity. The Wehrmacht's 1940 offensive eliminated all 3 simultaneously. The MAS-36 was a competent weapon orphaned by a command structure that dissolved before it could function. Japan. In the Pacific, the Arisaka's chrome-lined bore was not a laboratory advantage. It was a survival advantage. Allied weapons corroded in conditions of monsoon humidity and equatorial heat. Japanese rifles functioned. The Type 89 grenade discharger, persistently misnamed the knee mortar by Allied troops, was braced against logs or earth, never the knee. Firing it from the knee would have fractured the femur. Its actual indirect fire capability gave Japanese platoon-level infantry a suppression tool that Allied equivalents at the same echelon frequently lacked. Soviet Union. The PPS-43 submachine gun was not designed behind comfortable lines. It was designed, prototyped, tested, and manufactured inside the besieged city of Leningrad, while German forces held the perimeter. That 2.7-hour machining time wasn't an engineering achievement in isolation. It was the difference between rearming a surrounded city and surrendering it. Meanwhile, DP-27 crews in sustained firefights discovered the recoil spring's heat vulnerability firsthand. Prolonged suppressive fire warped the spring, reducing the gun to a single-shot liability at the moment continuous fire mattered most. The 1943 DPM correction came too late for the men who learned that lesson the hard way. United Kingdom. In 1914, instructor Alfred Snoxel set a world record with the Lee-Enfield that has never been officially broken. 38 aimed hits at 300 yards in 60 seconds. The established standard was 15. That record is not trivia. It is documented proof of the Enfield's ergonomic bolt cycle under maximum pressure, the kind of performance that translated directly to aimed fire in combat. After Dunkirk stripped Britain of equipment it couldn't immediately replace, the $10 Sten allowed the British Army to rebuild automatic fire capability at a scale and speed that a $200 Thompson economy simply could not have supported. Germany. Allied infantry learned the MG-42's vulnerability through hard experience and paid for that knowledge in blood. The beaten zone at 2,000 meters was a mathematically lethal construct, a dispersion pattern the size of a two-car garage that made exposure statistically unsurvivable. But the 250-round barrel threshold created a window. 12.5 seconds of sustained fire, then a mandatory swap. Allied fire and movement doctrine evolved specifically to exploit those seconds, pushing forward during the change, closing distance before the gun came back online. The MG-42 was tactically dominant. It was not tactically invulnerable. United States. December 1944, Bastogne. The 101st Airborne was surrounded, undersupplied, and holding. Veterans of that siege documented a tactic that has since passed into folklore, but is grounded in after-action accounts, dropping empty Garand clips onto frozen ground to generate the weapon's distinctive metallic ejection sound, the so-called ping, drawing German soldiers into the open under the assumption that the rifleman was reloading. They were cut down by BAR fire before they could act on that assumption. It worked because American squad architecture gave them the flexibility to run that bait. A squad built around a single machine gun cannot afford that kind of tactical creativity. A squad where every man is a credible threat can. Combat performance tells you what these weapons did. Legacy tells you what they changed, and why some of these designs are still influencing infantry doctrine today. Every weapon in this ranking eventually became obsolete. The lessons they produced did not. China's industrial migration is still studied, not as a story of failure, but as a case study in a question that every modern military logistician still debates. When resources are finite and time is shorter, do you produce the best weapon you can build or the most weapons you can build? The NRA chose volume. That choice kept an army in the field under conditions that would have dissolved a force dependent on precision manufacturing. Japan's metallurgical legacy is the most quietly ironic of the 8. The chrome-lined bore and the 120,000 psi receiver that American ordnance officers tested at Aberdeen in 1945 were vindicated in full by the United States Army, adopting chrome lining as standard in the 1960s. 15 years after defeating Japan, American infantry were carrying rifles built on a principle Japanese engineers had pioneered under wartime constraint. The Soviet efficiency model out of Leningrad established a design philosophy that every subsequent emergency weapons program has referenced, consciously or not. Reduce machining time, reduce raw material, maintain functional reliability. The PPS-43's 2.7-hour build time is the ancestor of every conflict's field expedient small arm. Germany's lesson is the one that resonates hardest with modern doctrine. The MG-42 was the most feared infantry weapon on the Western Front. It was also a single point of failure. One crew, one gun, one mortar round. and the squad's entire offensive capability evaporated. Allied fire and movement doctrine didn't defeat the MG-42 through superior firepower. It defeated it by understanding that architectural fragility. The American distributed lethality model has never been superseded. The principle that every rifleman in a squad represents an independent lethal node, not a support element for a crew-served weapon, remains the foundational logic of modern infantry design, from squad automatic weapons to individual designated marksman programs. 8 nations, 8 different answers to the same problem. The best loadout wasn't the one with the best weapon. It was the one built around a doctrine its industry could actually sustain. The Germans had the most feared weapon on the battlefield. The Americans won. The gap between those two facts is where military history actually lives. If this is the kind of analysis that cuts through the legend and gets to what actually mattered, hit subscribe. We go this deep on every video. There's a lot more history left to get right.